We have looked at, in describing this grand transition in thinking that I've been talking about since the first session, from mythic and mythopoetic thinking to rational forms of discourse and literacy. We've looked at pre-Socratic philosophy. We've looked at Herodotus and the origins of prose history. And last week we got to look a bit at the tragedians and what they've added to the tradition of the classical period. And now we're going into really the main line, the sort of the deeper thinkers and deeper fulfillment of what we saw the roots of over the last couple of weeks. And today we're going to look at Thucydides and his grand history of the Peloponnesian War, which I characterize right from the outset as the study of human nature, history as a pretext for making observations about the human situation and the nature of humans generally. So the Peloponnesian War itself begins after what we called last week the Pentekontesia, the 50-year period that defines a kind of golden age, certainly for Athens, but probably for the Greek world in general, between the final defeat of Xerxes and the Persians in 480-479, and this beginning of a pan-Hellenic civil war of sorts between the two coalitions of Athens and the Delian League, as it was called, because they used Delos as their meeting place, and the Spartan Confederacy based in the Peloponnese, the two grand powers in the Greek world. In that 50-year period, the Athenian navy, which was the turning point weapon in the war against the Persians, grew to a level of dominance that was equivalent to the effect of the British Navy in the early modern period, which gave this little island off the coast of Europe this colossal world presence. Athens had a presence way beyond their population, way beyond what they would have been able to exert in any other way, because it was a shipping empire that they built, both in trade and in exacted tribute. But trade concessions were made all over the Greek world. You got to play in the Athenian swimming pool, but you did so for a price. The only exceptions, the only cities that really escaped the web belonged to the Spartan Confederation, and the Spartans did not exact great amounts of tribute. Their strength was in their land-based army, and they were a very conservative political center that did not really have imperial desires, imperial expectations, the way Athens did. Neutrality in this world was a tough row to hoe because Athens rarely tolerated it. If they did so, they did it at a price. We'll call you neutral, but that means that you cave to our basic imperial designs whenever we really want them. And so eventually, there were cities that could tolerate this no longer. War breaks out, precipitated in part by people who are being pressured by Athens. The island in the map below, you see the island of Kerkyra, or what is modern Corfu, up in the center of the map there, off the west coast of Greece. That island is coming under Athenian domination. They appeal to Sparta. It precipitates a war. but it was just the straw that broke the camel's back. It was basically a number of places appealing to Sparta as an act of resistance to Athenian control. War breaks out. Sparta dominates the land war. Athens, with its fleet, dominates the sea war. They build the great walls down to the Piraeus so that their fleet is always accessible from the city proper, even when the Spartans hold the land right up to the Athenian walls. There is a major plague, which we'll take a close look at. In 429, after the beginning of the war, there's some setbacks on both sides. The leadership early in the Athenian leadership early in the war is that of Pericles, who had dominated the Golden Age period after the collapse of Persian threats. And he dies soon after the plague. Some argue that he was a victim of it. And a group of lesser leaders vie for control in a wartime setting of the Athenian assembly. There's kind of a stalemate period. It winds up with the so-called Peace of Nikias, Nikias being one of the leaders of the Aristoi, the best men, the upper classes of the Athenians. And it looks as if that might be the end of hostilities, except the war party, led by the arrogant, young, super talented phenom Alcibiades, or Alcibiades, as he would have been called, stirs the pot and says, we young men haven't had a chance to win our spurs. And he proposes an attack on Sicily, particularly on the great Spartan colony called Syracuse. It was itself a city that was nearly as powerful as Sparta, and with a navy of its own, and a force in the Western Mediterranean. And some of the Athenians thought this is a way to clip the wings of that bird early on. But at the same time, the young war party in Athens said, here's our chance to make our bones and to make our careers and to get leadership roles as strategoi, or generals, leading the invasion. This invasion, which begins in 415, this invasion fails catastrophically. And in modern printings of the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides devotes, I would say, a quarter of the book on the failed invasion, because he really saw this as the final denouement of the tragedy that he's writing. He himself stops his writing in 410. The war is not yet over. Between 410 and 404, Sparta, a resurgent Sparta with collateral help from the Persians, of all people, and you can see that on this map in the bottom, win some significant battles up in northern Ionia. You see those red attack lines, the one going up past Abydos. Major victories that throw the victory, the ultimate victory, to Sparta. And Athens and the Delian League, their imperial expansion is stopped forever, to the point that there's a kind of stasis, or static rivalry in the Greek world for the next 70 years. And it's during that period that the empire of Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander, begins to take on a larger and larger footprint in the Greek world. and come to dominate the Greek world. And the young phenomenon of that family, Alexander, goes on to create a new, if you will, Greek empire. And we'll see what happens to that a bit as we go on. So you can see in the map, if I can expand the map a little bit, the orangey areas are areas that belong to the Spartan Confederation. You see that they are anchored in the Peloponnesus, Pylos, Olympia, Sparta, and all the way to Thebes, the Ionian world, that sea-locked world, the coast from Athens all the way up through what would be Thessalonica and Stagira, where Aristotle's from, and Abdera, and all the way down the coast of Turkey is the Athenian stronghold. And the battle lines, the attack lines, the red ones are Spartan campaigns. And right from the earliest part of the war, the Spartans are able to get to the very walls of Athens, which of course they can't penetrate. And Athens can bring in grain. They're not really under siege. They have their sea empire to draw from, and they can hide behind their walls and strike at seaworthy targets as it suits their will. They were accomplished in land battles also, but the Spartan expertise in that regard was daunting, and it's not something that Athenian generals were going to make their bread and butter doing over the course of a long wall. Now, a few words about the class interests, lest you think, when we talk about wars between states, we tend to think that there's a kind of unified personality in each state. It's the French fighting the Germans. It's the Spartans fighting the Athenians. This is a complex political environment in which all the cities involved in the Greek world had multiple class interests. There were aristoi, there were people of old family wealth for centuries. They had been in place. And some of these clans just passed political control of the cities, the way you can imagine it would have been done in later European settings, for instance. The aristoi in all cities, including those in the Delian League, the Athenian-controlled so-called democratic cities, the aristoi in those cities identified with Spartan interests. As the hoi polloi, the many, the lower to working classes of all cities would identify and see an agent, an advocate in Athenian interests. It was very common for in the nexus of the war, in wartime chaos, it was very common for a aristocratic controlled assembly to suddenly push towards resisting their ally, their heretofore ally, the Athenians, politically, to resist them politically, to flip sides. This was a common pressure in many cities. So you had the battle of ideas and political interests within a city as well as between cities. So the aristoi, as I say in this top little paragraph, in a polis of the Athenian League would often look for any opportunity to rebel, especially since the tribute that the city paid, if they were in the Delian League, would largely come from that class. They were the people who had the money to pay the tribute tax, if you will. So on the bottom, the map on the left basically just makes the point that the red arrow, it's Spartan land offensives versus Athenian sea offense and land defense so that they could maintain trade. We have in the middle here a relief of a Spartan with the classic helmet, a Spartan hoplite, one of their fully armed knights, if you will. And on the right, a graphic that basically describes the entire war in three phases. The stalemate at 431 to 421, the interlude, the peace of Nikias for 6 years, and then finally in the last stage, a Spartan victory after 413. So by 404, it is over. And it's right after it is over that we get pressure on the political powers in Athens to have Socrates brought to trial and executed. Socrates, who fought for Athens during the early phases of the war. Anyhow, we come to the great man himself, Thucydides, 460 to 400 BC, an Athenian, by far the greatest and most influential of the ancient historians. He is considered the Ur historian through the Roman period. In fact, I show you this mosaic on the right, which is from Jordan in the 3rd century AD of Thucydides, and a Greek-speaking part of the world. Of course, you're in Jordan, you're in the Levant. And his influence and fame and his use as a model extends all the way into the modern period. So that I mentioned here, and I'll have more to say about this later on, the first English translation of the book was by the great political theorist of the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes, in 1629. And his translation from the original, well-educated Englishman, is considered a work of art in its own right. It's sometimes read as a primary text in its own right, not just as a translation. So Thucydides was an Athenian. He was born during the Golden Age and raised, he was 30 by the time we get to the beginning of the war. Allegedly, when he was a boy, he heard Herodotus reading at the Odeon. Herodotus would have been reading from his histories in around 445, 444. And then he heard these readings and he, like I said, legend has it, wept for joy. He survived the plague. He caught the plague and survived it. And in 429, and he served as a general, a strategos, in 424, where a major port city fell while under his watch, Amphipolis, in the northern Aegean. And he is treated fairly harshly. He's exiled, ostracized, ostrakismos, the Greek tradition of throwing somebody out if they're not up to snuff. And this actually, before the class began, somebody commented, I think it was Don, that he tells the tales of the war from both sides fairly accurately. And it's, I think, because of the exile, he actually gets to see the war from the Spartan side as much as he does from the Athenian side, even though that's where he was identified. And so this quote, "I lived through the whole of it, being of an age to comprehend events and giving my attention to them in order to know the exact truth about them. It was also my fate to be in exile from my country for 20 years after my command at Amphipolis, and being present with both parties, and more especially with the Peloponnesians by reason of my exile, I had leisure to observe affairs somewhat particularly." He said, so he admits it. I have this privileged position for making historical judgments. Now, he makes great claims early in the book about the significance of this war. and he was very aware of the scale of his project. And it strikes to the heart of some of the claims I'm going to make about the book. He understood that he was writing more than this war. He understood that he had witnessed things that were not widely discussed in the traditions of literacy up until that point, that he was going to make claims about human nature and the nature of war and the nature of events that hadn't been made before. He realized he was doing something revolutionary. So he says, Thucydides, an Athenian, right at the beginning of the book, wrote the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, beginning at the moment that it broke out and believing that it would be a great war and more worthy of relation than any that had preceded it. This belief was not without its grounds. Indeed, this was the greatest movement yet known in history, not only of the Hellenes, but of a large part of the barbarian world. I had almost said of mankind, which he probably believed. He discusses his methods early on in book one, right? Book one, chapter one, which is a modern convention. Historians people who write primary history now usually write the first couple of chapters on their methodologies, their biases, their aims, their angles. They place themselves in the historiographical discussion. They say, as a historian, here is how I am acting. I want you to be able to judge me and what I say accurately. So I'm going to tell you about how I think about what I'm saying. And it's like the classic approach of all modern history. After suggesting that the accounts of the poets are exaggerations and in the realm of legend, he also points out that the vulgar, the general reading public, have little appetite for real evidence. And he says, well, I've got to rectify that. And then he describes his methods. And there are two main arenas that I want you to keep in mind as we think about the book. He talks about what he calls speeches. Through the book, he does standard narrative, the kind of narrative you would expect, if you're reading the high school chapter on the history of World War II, then this happened, then that happened, and then this general went there, and then these battles were fought. But he stops for these, close-in camera angles and gives speeches or entire conversations between significant parties, close-ups, as I'll call them later on. And he says about these up front, with reference to the speeches in this history, some were delivered before the war began, others while it was going on. Some I heard myself. I was there, I was a witness. Others I got from various quarters. It was in all cases difficult to carry them word for word in one's memory. So, my habit has been to make the speaker say what was, in my opinion, demanded of them by the various occasions. Of course, adhering as closely as possible to the general sense of what they really said. So I'm going to try to repeat what they really said. But more importantly, I'm going to have them say what the logic of the occasion demanded that they say. What are we to make of this? He said, well, it isn't just what somebody said, it's the impact it had, it's the angle that they had as they tried to manipulate circumstances or a given audience. So I, as the historian, understanding the logic of the moment, might alter the literal discourse of what they said to tell you what they really said, or if you will, what they meant. It's an astonishing statement. And it's the sort of thing that a modern historian would do in another way, but of course would still do this. They might give you the literal speech and then say, now let me unpack this for you. Let us see what the circumstances demanded of Winston Churchill at this moment, or whatever, and whomever. Then he says, and we'll get back, because we're going to look at some of these speeches. Then he says about fact-checking. And with reference to the narrative of events, far from permitting myself to derive it from the first source that came to hand, I did not even trust my own impressions. But it rests partly on what I saw myself, partly on what others saw for me, the accuracy of the report being always tried by the most severe and detailed tests possible. My conclusions have cost me some labor from the want of coincidence between accounts of the same occurrences by different eyewitnesses, arising sometimes from imperfect memory, sometimes from undue partiality for one side or the other. Different witnesses to the same thing tell different stories. The absence of romance in my history, and this is sort of a little side dig at Herodotus, I think. The absence of romance in my history will, I fear, detract somewhat from its interest. So if you're looking for a good story, I might not be the best provider of that. If you're looking for what happened, I might be the best source for that. But if it be judged useful by those inquirers who desire an exact knowledge of the past as an aid to the interpretation of the future. Remember how you were told in history class in high school, why study history? So you see what is happening around you as a reference point and what will be repeated in the future. What did Mark Twain say? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, which in the course of human things must resemble if it does not reflect it. I shall be content. So the future will resemble the past in the course of human things. Why will it resemble the past? Because what is history about? For him, it's human nature working out destiny in the world. So remember the pre-Socratic philosophers struggling with the idea of an arche, a substrate that persists through a change. Well, events may change, but human nature is the substrate that has some givens to it. And that is what I want to examine. And that's why the future will resemble the past, because we're still us. And fine, I have written my book not as an essay which is to win the applause of the moment, but as a possession for all time. And here we are, 25 centuries later, and we're reading the book because he knew what he was doing and he knew what he was talking about. Now, simply as a narrator, with his strict adherence to methods of verification, he wrote the first historical narrative according to modern standards that would be judged reasonable effort by modern standards, albeit with less color than, let's say, Herodotus, and certainly a lot less color than in Homer. And except for the first century Roman historians, first century AD, Roman historian Tacitus, the quality of his research and narrative wasn't achieved again until the Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries. We don't find historical narratives that can match that level of evidence. But as I pointed out, Why did he think his work would be a possession for all time? The narration of the Great War was significant, but Thucydides saw in it, and I want to stress this first word, a dramatic revelation of human nature. That was nothing like the traditional representations of human nature as provided by religion, myth, and epic. Religion, myth, and epic had a story about who we are, a creation story, an identity story. Here is how you should be. This is what a hero is. Here is how you should act. This is what piety is. This is what reverence is. This is the way humans are to be. And Thucydides is here to tell us, guess what, gang? They didn't quite get it right. And I am going to show you how they didn't get it right. And I'm going to get it right for you. He does this, and this is the overarching argument that I want to make about the book, which I consider, by the way, I consider the book we're looking at this week and the book we're going to be looking at next week as perhaps, well, I know they're my two favorite all-time reads, but I would argue that they are two of the absolute seminal books ever produced by Western civilization, if not out and out the two most important books in the last 25 centuries. And the argument I want to make is that he organizes the book as a tragedy. He uses the art form for communicating the human condition that had been developed in the classical period, developed to fulfillment. Remember, he's a contemporary of Euripides, as well as Sophocles, for that matter. And he uses that tool for communication, that tool for organizing how you understand the world and human placement in the world as a template. But it's not going to be the template to explain myth or human nature in the abstract. He's going to create a drama based on events. He sees the arc, if you will, of the Peloponnesian War as a drama that follows. Do you remember last week when I used this very same diagram with the red arrows and the stars to depict the Aristotelian theory of the arc of tragedy, how a tragedy starts off with its first event, follows the characters up and if you will, to a critical point where some reversal, some revelation, some self-recognition of based in a flaw or based in a tragic event or based in the folly of the gods playing with us leads to a downhill reversal and a final denouement that is the tragic ending. And we, the audience, are identified with it. We can see it. We can understand it. We are filled, as Aristotle says, with pity and fear, and we are purged. And he sees himself, but Thucydides, as being the playwright, if you will, of that organizes the narrative of what actually happened. And guess what? That written to the structure of events is tragedy. It is, and there's the tragic arc. Now, these close-ups that I mentioned on the previous slide, the narrative is punctuated by a number of scenes that focus on what Thucydides refers to as speeches. These could be regarded as arbitrary, like why put a speech here? Why put a, in fact, if you had a chance to read those little excerpts that I printed out in the PDF, one of, if you will, the speeches is a dialogue in which no real characters are speaking. He has an abstraction for the Athenian envoys speaking, and this is in the Melian dialogue. He has an abstraction of Melian citizens and an abstraction of Athenian attackers speaking to each other. It's a made-up dialogue in which he's trying to epitomize the actual messages and beliefs that each side was pitting against the other in that moment. And so you could regard these speeches as made-up constructs to flesh out a story, but he sees them as key episodes in a dramatic structure that will explain future events as they play out. And so using that, again, that Aristotelian template, we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The war is precipitated by the battle over the argument over Kikira. And then as soon as he gets past stating the methods he's going to use and the beginning of the war, the very first book one, is it book one or book two? I forget now. Close-up that he shows is the funeral oration that Pericles, early in the war, delivers to Athenians over the fallen remains of the first Athenian soldiers to die in the war. And what we see in it is an idealization of what Athens means at its best to its citizens. It's an idealization of the city of Athens. It's the upward movement. It's the exposition of who we are when we are at our best. It's who we are and who we would like to think we are. It's our best self. It's the angels of our nature. And then he follows it immediately by the plague chapter, by this horrific 4 or 5 page description of the devastating effects of the plague on Athens. And it seems to be a departure from the history of the war. Why all this commentary on the symptoms and the sense of hopelessness of the people who were victimized and even the survivors? Why this obsession with this chronicled event that could be seen as a part of some other study, not a history of the war? Because he sees it as the apex of the reversal. It is the revelation of what human nature will do and how it will respond when it is pushed into extreme circumstances. This is not Achilles and his war cry. This is real people and what they actually did when the world seemed to fall apart. And then he follows that first with the debate on Mytilene, which is a debate over what to do with the citizens of a city that had been an ally, but that had now revolted when they got their opportunity. And what should we do? Even though that it was the aristocrats triggering the revolt, what should we do with the entire population? And there was at first this very angry reaction in the city of Athens. We've been betrayed by one of our allies. Let's put them all to death. And then they retrench. Then there is a debate in the assembly on the second day. And there are those who want to say, hey, our anger's abated a little bit. Didn't we overreact here? But they don't make the case of not killing everyone based on a moral argument. They base it on an argument from self-interest. The argument to kill or not to kill becomes one of what is in our best interest to do. It is not the moral authority argument that would have been made by a Pericles. It's not, we are above this. We are good people. This isn't how good humans solve their political issues. They make the right choice, but it's a weakened choice. And then by the time we get to the Melian dialogue, where Athens confronts the island of Melos, they confront an island port that has not been an ally of theirs. They've never fought for the Spartans. They are strictly neutral. They've shown up at the door and they've said, surrender. Just surrender. We're stronger than you. It's in your interest not to die. It's in our interest as the stronger to do what the strong always do. And we're just taking over. And we could make fine speeches about it and justify our actions. But really, let's face facts here. This is the way the big boy, put on your big boy pants. This is the way the world works. This is what we're going to do. So they have sunk into this level of self-interested cynicism. And by 415, which the final denouement, the most talented, but albeit corrupted, young aristocrat in Athens, the man who should be the next Pericles, Alcibiades, a student of Socrates, gets to lead, to argue for, but not lead, to argue for a Sicilian expedition so that he can further expand his reputation, which will come to destruction because the Athenians, fearing that they could not trust this best product of their cultural development at this point, because he was too self-interested, because he so wanted, in a kind of callous, obvious way, to enhance his own reputation, and this is the final act of the tragedy. The best general that they've produced, they can't use because they don't trust them. So they send an inferior general, Nicias, who blows up the expedition, and they fail miserably, and the city falls in the end. And what you can see here is that the protagonist of this tragedy is the city itself, which is what he intends from the outset. Now, to look at this in a little more detail, the unfolding of the drama. So we have the funeral oration, it's in book 2, of Pericles. He establishes the character of the protagonist, the city of Athens. I mean, it's really, he's eulogizing the soldiers, but the entire speech is about how wonderful Athens is. And he says at the end of the speech, in effect, these guys were lucky to have died for so great a city. In short, I say that as a city, we are the school of Hellas. While I doubt if the world can produce a man who, where he has only himself to depend on, is equal to so many emergencies and graced by so happy a versatility as the Athenian, we're it. We're the cat's meow. We're the city that can produce soldiers and scholars, tragedians, men of culture. So the dead, who he's there allegedly to deliver his oration for, they're worthy of the city. It is not the city are worthy of them, they're worthy of the city. The citizen, not the individual, is the center of moral value. So died these men as became Athenians. You, their survivors, must determine to have as unfaltering a resolution in the field, though you may pray that it may have a happier issue. And not contented with ideas derived only from words of the advantages which are bound up with the defense of your country, though these would furnish a valuable text to a speaker even before an audience so alive to them as the present, you must yourselves realize the power of Athens and feed your eyes upon her day from day to day, till love of her fills your hearts. And then when all her greatness shall break upon you, you must reflect that it was by courage, sense of duty, and a keen feeling of honor and action that men were enabled to win all this, and that no personal failure in an enterprise could make them consent to deprive their country of their valor. But they laid it at her feet as the most glorious contribution that they could offer. So Athens, at this point in the tragedy, is led by the Ariston, the best of men, Pericles, to show the decay, the moral decay of the city. You move from Pericles through figures like Cleon, who we'll get to in a minute, and wind up with Alcibiades. But here, Pericles, we begin with the best, a benevolent father figure who in other passages scolds and shames bad behavior. He's able to scold citizens when they fall shy of the mark. The city, reeling from the first effects of the war, is brought back to its core values and spirit of self-sacrifice by a man with moral authority. So this is the straw man of the tragedy, the well-intentioned protagonist. Then one of the most astonishing chapters in the book and in any history that you'll ever read is the plague chapter in book 2, which follows right on the funeral oration. Human futility in the face of the plague. And he does it with such objectivity and dispassion. It's really an astonishing few pages. Neither were the physicians at first of any service, ignorant as they were of the proper way to treat it, but they died themselves the most thickly as they visited the sick most often. Nor did any human art succeed any better. Supplications in the temples, divinations, and so forth were found equally futile, till the overwhelming nature of the disaster at last put a stop to them altogether. So religion and traditional remedies all fail, but people just sort of give up the ghost, and religious observance falls by the wayside. And here he is, the disciplined observer again. all speculation as to its origin and its causes. If causes can be found adequate to produce so great a disturbance, I leave to other writers, whether lay or professional. For myself, I shall simply set down its nature and explain the symptoms by which perhaps it may be recognized by the student if it should ever break out again. This I can the better do as I had the disease myself and watched its operation in the case of others. But people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head and redness and inflammation in the eyes. The inward parts, such as the throat or tongue, became bloody and emitting an unnatural and fetid breath. These symptoms were followed by sneezing and hoarseness, after which the pain soon reached the chest and produced a hard cough. When it fixed in the stomach, it upset it, and discharges of bile of every kind named by physicians ensued, accompanied by very great distress. In most cases, also, an ineffectual retching followed, producing violent spasms, which in some cases ceased soon after, and others much later. And there's a 17th century painting that I put in. This became a subject, by the way, of much painting. This one is a Dutch, I guess, a Dutch Golden Age painting, Michael Swert's Plague in an Ancient City. The breakdown that follows the plague of traditional social norms. For as the disaster passed all bounds, men, not knowing what was to become of them, became utterly careless of everything, whether sacred or profane. All the burial rites before in use were entirely upset, and they buried the bodies as best they could. Many had recourse to the most shameless sepultures. They threw their own dead body upon the stranger's pyre and ignited it. Sometimes they tossed the corpse on top of another that was burning and so went off. So all social norms collapse, and following social norms, lawlessness. Nor was this the only form of lawless extravagance which owed its origin to the plague. Men now coolly ventured on what they had formerly done in a corner, seeing the rapid transitions produced by persons in prosperity suddenly dying, and those who before had nothing succeeding to their property. So they resolved to spend quickly and enjoy themselves, regarding their lives and riches as alike things of a day. It's all going to pass. Live the life of consumption. Perseverance in what men called honor was popular with none. It was so uncertain whether they would be spared to attain the object. But it was settled that present enjoyment and all that contributed to it was both honorable and useful. Fear of gods or law of man, there was none to restrain them. As for the first, they judged it to be just the same whether they worshiped them or not, as they saw all alike perishing. And for the last, no one expected to live to be brought to trial for his offenses, but each felt that a far severer sentence had been already passed upon them. All hung ever over their heads, and before this fell, it was only reasonable to enjoy life a little. So under stress, the trappings of morality, religion, tradition, and civility collapse. And this is a peek into what human nature is capable of. He moves from there to the debate on Miele. And as I said before, here it is, Miele is in the Northeast. It's the rebellion of an allied city, incited by their aristocratic faction, a tributary polis in the Athenian League. Miele rebelled over the objections and resistance of the commoners. This so angered a war-traumatized Athenian assembly that when the city was recaptured, they passed a resolution to punish by death and enslavement Mitylene's entire population. So the next day they reopen the debate, and then the debate is between two figures, Cleon, this angry war party opportunist and a famous demagogue, and a man named Diodotus, who we'll get to in a moment. Cleon, described by Thucydides as the most violent man in Athens. We've gone from Pericles to Cleon as the demagogue who's influencing the assembly. And at that time, by far the most powerful with the commons. Cleon makes the case that it is in Athens' self-interest to punish the entire population of Mytilene. I have often before now been convinced that a democracy is incapable of empire, and never more so than by your present change of mind in the matter of Mytilene. Fears or plots being unknown to you in your daily relations with each other, he flatters them. You feel just the same with regard to your allies and never reflect that the mistakes into which you may be led by listening to their appeals or by giving way to your compassion, you can't give way to your compassion, are full of anger, full of danger to yourselves and bring you no thanks for your weakness from your allies, entirely forgetting that your empire is a despotism and your subjects are disaffected conspirators whose obedience is ensured not by your suicidal concessions, but by the superiority given you by your own strength, not their loyalty. For if they were right in rebelling, you must be wrong in ruling. However, if right or wrong, you determine to rule, you must carry out your principle and punish the Mytileneans as your interest requires, or else you must give up your empire and cultivate honesty without danger. And the answer that Diodotus gives back to this before we get even further is essentially that cities are going to have rebellions, and if you are seen as punishing everybody in the city, then once a rebellion has taken place, there is no other way out. They will fight you to the death because they'll say, oh, we can't go to the Athenians and say, some of us fought in your interests right to the end, spare us. They will join the party of rebellion and resisting you. And so the argument that Diodotus has to make in response to Cleon is essentially that it too is in our self-interest to spare the innocent. And so they do the right thing, but the argument made for the right thing still has to be based on a principle of self-interest. They can't just say killing the innocent women and children is abhorrent. You can't say that. The discourse, the political discourse of the city has decayed to the point where the only argument, effectual argument you can make at this point is what is effective for our interests. So then he moves to the next close-up, if you will, in book 5, the Melian dialogue. This is a city on an island which is neutral, and Athens just demands their capitulation. There's been no rebellion. There's been no aggression. Nobody in Melos has ever tried to side with the Peloponnesian Confederation. And so Thucydides constructs an utterly anonymous dialogue, totally anonymous, and keeping with his stated device of making the speakers say what was, in my opinion, demanded of them by the various occasions. And the argument they make is entirely one of realpolitik. And what we're going to see here is what becomes the text for Plato in Republic next week to address the argument that deep down human nature is about the desire to be the tyrant, the desire to have one's will, to use one's strength to impose one's will on the world. And that the only reason we find that morally abhorrent is that because most people are weak and band together, sort of the Thomas Hobbes argument in the Leviathan, that people are weak and afraid of being dominated by others. So laws are constructed and mores are constructed for self-defense by the many, who are the weaker. But that human nature is an acquisitive, appetitive, desiring, domineering child within that wants all. A late friend of mine once saw my son when he was in a crib and throwing a little bit of a fit. But people who were over to the apartment at the time were cooing about how cute he was and how endearing he was, this little 6-month-old who was going nuts in the crib. And my friend commented, you realize, of course, that he were 6 feet tall and 240 pounds, he would destroy all of us right now. As a great joke, but saying, here is this libidinal, appetitive self who wants to master the world, and he has to be socialized into moral conduct along with the rest of us here. But the Athenians in this dialogue, they just make the argument from strength that right and justice are mere social conventions that are observed when no party has the upper hand. So the Athenians are saying, for ourselves, we shall not trouble you with specious pretenses, either of how we have a right to our empire because we overthrew the Mede, the Persians, or are now attacking you because of wrong that you have done us, and make a long speech which would not be believed, which would not be, you can almost hear Putin making an on-camera speech at this point, right? Which nobody believes. We can talk here, right? We're behind closed doors. This is a private speech between you and us. Let's not kid ourselves. In return, we hope that you will aim at what is feasible, holding in view the real sentiments of us both, since you know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Might makes right. So the Athenians speaking again, when you speak of the favor of the gods, we may as fairly hope for that as yourselves. Why not us? Neither our pretensions nor our conduct being in any way contrary to what men believe of the gods or practice among themselves. We know what the gods are like. They go for the gold too. I've read my Homer. They go for the gold. Of the gods we believe, and of men we know that by a necessary law of their nature, they rule wherever they can. It is the rule of nature. And it is not as if we were the first to make this law or to act upon it when made. We found it existing before us and shall leave it to exist forever after us. All we do is to make use of it, knowing that you and everybody else, having the same power as we have, would do the same as we do. If you were in this position, wouldn't you? And so we're at the end of the tether. The moral decline, exposed by the extremities of the plague and battle weariness, has come to this. And then he proceeds to the debate on the Sicilian expedition after some years of hiatus in the war, with Athenian sea power in a very dominant position. A proposal is put forth by Thucydides to organize an expedition to invade Sicily. The spokesman for the old guard, Nicias, argues that an invasion is risky and that Alcibiades proposes one only out of a desire for personal glory. And Alcibiades, at the Olympics, he had the largest number of teams in the chariot races. I mean, he was this rich spendthrift, young narcissist. There have been accusations about the indulgent and reckless life of Alcibiades and his circle. The assembly approves the expedition, but distrusting Alcibiades gives the command to Nicias, the less talented general. And so the expedition ends in disaster. So here we have the tragic flaw. Alcibiades is the young golden boy of the Athenian aristocracy, famously handsome, brilliant, generous, accomplished, and rich. He is the epitome, the word for gentleman or knight, if you will, in Greek at this point, was a joining of two words, kalos agathon. The kalos agathon, which means beautiful, first word is beautiful, kalos, and agathon, good. So the gentleman was the beautiful and the good. He was the perfect product of Athenian culture. But Athens had been corrupted by the war and opted for the lesser man. Whatever his ability, self-interest and self-regard had made Alcibiades morally unacceptable. Here's Alcibiades speaking in the debate, such are my aspirations, and however I am abused for them in private, the question is whether anyone manages public affairs better than I do. And of course, the answer is no, but they don't give him the leadership. So the drama's begun with Pericles, and it ends with the young Alcibiades not leading them, but forcing them into this disastrous war in Sicily. And you're often in art going to see Alcibiades always paired with his teacher, Socrates. And here we have Socrates tearing Alcibiades in this allegory from the embrace of sensual pleasure. They say that when Alcibiades boarded the ships to go out to campaign, that the hetairae, the prostitutes in Athens, from the corner of prostitutes, were flinging roses from their balconies as their major patron in all his beauty and glory marched out to war. So what we have then in the classical period is several pictures of human nature's dark side. We talked about Euripides last week, and during the Peloponnesian War, he was busy writing plays that examine the dark Dionysian irrational elements in the human character. The Trojan Women, written in 415, as the Sicilian expedition was getting organized, examines the fate of women after the fall of Troy, and it is not a pretty picture. It is widely believed to be a commentary on the slaughter and subjugation of the population of Melos, the Melian dialogue, after its capture. It's a commentary on it. He's writing a play about it. Thucydides writes a historical depiction of it, but Euripides was writing a play about the same thing. Thucydides, the depiction of human nature in his history was equally dark. When subjected to the stresses of plague and war, civility, morality, and justice were presented as ideals, but not as innately natural. We're far from the Rousseauian belief that man is born good, but everywhere he is in chains. Man is born innately domineering and acquisitive, and must be restrained. Thucydides very much fits the modern political conservative traditions that have a dire vision of human nature and the need for law and restraint as a controlling guide, set of guideposts. During this period of the war, and before the war, through the war, and after the war, and we're going to talk about these folks quite a bit next week, there are these really couple of generations of intellectuals referred to in the Greek literature as sophists, those who purport to know, professional teachers who wander the Greek polis, they go from city to city usually, offering to teach particularly rhetoric and philosophy for fees to the aristoi, the sons of the wealthy. And the teaching of rhetoric, remember, this is a world, especially in the democracies, in which, but even in the oligarchies, in which some form of a public assembly was the determining factor for policy. And your ability to speak well and articulate ideas well and to cut a figure in front of the audience was the primary source, given the fact that there were no other media, the primary source of one attracting, one's ability to attract the attention and consideration of one's fellows. And those teachers were often, these professional teachers, often were new thinkers, if you will, who were, if they weren't convinced that traditional religion and morality were human constructs, they certainly were teaching at least that there were so many opinions outstanding as to what really was the case with religion and traditional morality as to throw it all into doubt. Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. This whole idea that there are several different takes on what is the case and what is true and what is a moral value. And so they often espoused positions that either were overtly relativistic and speaking for a moral relativism, or were implicitly suggesting a moral relativism, even though publicly one would never stand up in front of an assembly and say, honor and goodness don't matter. Even if one believed it, the idea would be how to, and we have many examples of this before us as we speak, do we not? How to appear interested in traditional values when one is using it only for one's own gain and reputation. They profess to teach young aristocrats the ways to become successful in the political realm. These were not all corrupt people by any regard. They're usually well thought of in the Greek tradition, but they were people who Plato is going to depict in a very negative fashion. They were people who were addressing how to achieve success in the public marketplace, in the political realm that they found, the real world. And of course, to an arch moralist like Socrates and Plato, his student, that's going to seem like a corrupt message. Where is honor? As Falstaff says, he that died on Wednesdays, he was looking at a dead body in the fields, right? So in Plato, who we're going to be turning to next, an Athenian who was born during the war, very early in the war, and a student of Socrates, the arch-moralist, Plato would take as his text, if you will, his topic, his subject of interest, the dark vision of human nature that has been depicted by Euripides, by Thucydides, and by the sophists. He wants to make a case that justice, truth, and good were objective qualities and that human nature, properly educated, can rise to their standard. He is, in a sense, a conservative. He wants to achieve the lost certitude of moral absolutism that you got in a religious world without using the old mythic structure. He wants to use the new disciplines. He's a philosopher, but he wants to establish that principles of justice, truth, good, honor are defensible philosophically, that there really is a defensible ought, not that they ought, what ought happen, what ought someone ought be, is not simply a construct made up by the weak, as Cleon would have us believe. A comment in keeping with this image of the dark side. We only have this in one more slide. Thomas Hobbes, who I mentioned, was the great translator in the 17th century into English, the first English edition of the history. He not only translated, he drew a map of classical Greece himself. In his later work, what is Hobbes famous for? Well, in Leviathan and De Cive, another book written in the same period, following the English Civil War, Hobbes described human life in the state of nature as a bleak and unforgiving competition among rivals. Human nature is going to reduce us to a bleak and uncompromising competition. And if you look at human nature in the state of nature, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, in one of the most famous quotations from English philosophy. He saw the chaos of the English Civil War as a confirmation of this assessment. And so he argued for civil society being based on a voluntary social contract by which all men submitted their natural rights to life and self-determination, submitted to an absolute monarch in exchange for an orderly and prosperous life. So looking at the Civil War and finding it utterly abhorrent, he wanted to, much like a Thucydides looking at the dark side in the Peloponnesian War, he says, well, the only way this can be avoided is by arguing for a social contract by which justice is established as on the basis of the sacrifice of your own self-determination by submission to an absolute monarch. And his interest in Thucydides, he actually says in his autobiography that he was attracted to the book because Thucydides, in this little quote I have in the box at the bottom, shows how incompetent democracy is. That's what he claims. He sees the book as the tragedy of Athens displayed with Hobbes's own bias as sort of an explication of the superiority of a monarchical model. And in the frontispiece of the first publication of the book, you got a depiction of Lacedaemon that says up here, that's Sparta, and Athene, this is Athens, and here's Archidamnos, the king of Sparta, one of the kings of Sparta. Here's Pericles at the beginning of the war, and something I find very telling at the bottom, he has on the Spartan side the hoi aristoi, and he has this very civilized looking group of the best men conferring among themselves. And what does he show the hoi polloi? Here's the mob being controlled by a Cleon-like figure, a demagogue, who's going to twist the mob to his own private worst desires. So we've looked at this comparison a couple times already, and I just want to put another spin on it. And that cultural transition, which I said, which is what this course is entirely about, and the movement from a world that had tribal organization and oral transmission and communication and mythic explanation to one that was politically organized, that used literary transmission, and that used analytic explanation. Well, there is an unfortunate, and if not unfortunate, a downside that has to be met within the discourse, because it's also a transition from a world in which values are self-evident, religious values, they're just tribally accepted, which has a moral clarity to it. You know who you should be, you know what the models are, there can be no self-doubt, you are the Achilleus to go out and fight for your own private honor. And it is a world that has a great degree of certainty, moral certainty and intellectual certainty at its root. It's a simple world. It's the world that always answers people's questions. Oh, isn't it nice? Isn't it nice to be a true religious believer when you're close to death? You don't have the doubts. You have a sense of certainty. You have this moral clarity. It's a simple world. It's an easily self-explained world. But the world that has emerged as a result of these transitions in the classical period is one in which values are not so self-evident. The arche, the logos is hidden, as the philosophers had told us. Unsettled values, moral confusion, the debate on Mytilene. What are we supposed to think here? We don't want to put innocent women and children to death or sell them off into slavery. It's a world in which moral relativism is considered perhaps the most accurate description of human nature. So if one is going to argue for a code of honor, a code of law, a code of morality that is not merely a convenient construct, that is not merely a social convention, one is going to have to do it using the tools that have now been evolved of analytic explanation. You're going to have to create a world of, if not obvious certitude, if not self-evident certainty, one of assurance at least, using all the new weapons at the disposal of the more modern citizen of the world. Plato, as I said, takes that as his text, which is why every political question, every political option, theoretical option, every oppositional discussion about the nature of politics, ethics, and morality ever made in the last 25 centuries was made in Republic. They're all there. There's almost no take on the possible positions that Plato wasn't familiar with. And so what we have is a book that if you ever study ethics in any college course or political theory in any college course, that book is going to be there. Anyhow, that's next week, gang. There's a few pages that in the PDF on Plato that I sent you guys earlier. It might be worth taking a peek. I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to remove the pin. And here we are. Anybody want to comment or question or?
Yeah, well, Lou, I just want to thank you for that. That was a brilliant analysis and portrayal of the marvelous spectrum of the ancient world. And it brought me a great clarity. So I thank you for it.
I'll
Thank you.
second that.
Do I have a third?
Indeed, indeed.
Okay, gang. So I would say with that, until next week,
Okay. Adios.
adios, my friends.
See you next week.